Hello and welcome to another video. So this time around, I want to be talking about a question that has come up a bunch in terms of things you should know before doing a games degree. Often this actually comes up in the actual sort of version of should someone do a games degree, but I want to sort of take a bit of a step back and look at, okay, what's actually involved in ones and alternatives to them. So let's dive on in. So again, this is an area that there can be quite strong opinions on both sides on. So this isn't going to be a, yep, you have to do a degree, it's the only option, or, no, you should never consider doing a degree at all. I want to also not recommend specific degrees. I'm also not going to be, recommending specific places to avoid. I want to talk about the things that you can get out of a degree and also the things to be looking for in a provider of those degrees as well as alternatives. So you can be informed when you're actually sort of picking ones and ask questions and try and make sure that it's the right decision for you. So in terms of what makes me qualified to actually talk about this, so I've been a game developer for many, many, many years now. I also taught game development, and as part of that, there was a lot of teaching. There was also designing the actual sort of curriculum assessments for particular subjects and also having input on the overall degrees. And I also taught at I think pretty much every stage of the degree. So I've had a fair bit of experience with doing this. I have a degree, but it isn't in games. From the actual game side, I am self-taught on the programming side and all the stuff, in terms of games. I've learnt that either myself or from, having the opportunities to get to work alongside a lot of really awesome, developers and teachers of development. So there's a lot of stuff that I've learned there not from my degree. So my degree was actually in engineering, so some overlap there, but it wasn't one in games. So, okay, firstly, degree, there's a lot of different things that we could be meaning by this. And the specific terms can vary a bit from country to country. And I obviously will be using terms that I know are accurate for Australia. They might be different terms, though, in other countries. But I'll try and sort of describe things in a way where if it is a different term in your country, where you can sort of line up. There's likely going to be something that's pretty close to that. So, one point we have what we refer to here generally as something like a diploma or a graduate certificate. So these are generally shorter courses, typically going to be often under a year. And these are sometimes offered as a bit of a preview for a course. So they can be a good way to get a bit of familiarity with, okay, what is their approach to teaching at a place? What are the, kinds of things that you would be doing? It's pretty common, and certainly something that I would be checking and looking for is that you can get credit for some or all of that course you've done if you then want to go on and do a longer course. Now, an important thing with these short courses is it's not really realistic to have the view of you could go and do one of these short courses and then easily go into industry. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is being a shorter course, there's not as much time to cover a broad range of things or to cover things in much depth. It's going to generally be pretty high level and a pretty sort of narrowly focused set of stuff that can be talked about just because of the time. There's also the fact that there are going to be a lot of people going and doing the longer degrees. So doing courses where they are spending a lot of time and covering a larger area, developing a larger portfolio and building up more experience. And there's a lot of people often going through those degrees, which means if you're trying to apply for positions and you've got a diploma or you're one of those shorter courses and someone else has got one of those longer courses, you're kind of going up against someone who straight off the bat has, at least provably on paper, more experience. Often, at least double the experience that you'll have. So that makes it very, very difficult. So that is a really important thing with these shorter courses, that make sure you have realistic expectations of what happens at the end of the course. That's really important. So in terms of those longer degrees, the main one that I generally see would be something like an associate or bachelor degree. An associate degree is generally going to be about 3/4 of the length of a bachelor's degree. Some places might also offer a bachelor's degree with the option of an honours year or an honours component to it, which is usually going to extend it a little bit further again. So these degrees, you're typically going to see them being around 2 to 4 years as the minimum. Kind of depends how many teaching periods the place has in a year. Some will have 2, some might have 3. So it's going to vary a fair bit there. These have time to go significantly deeper, not just on individual topics, but on a wide range of topics. So you get a greater breadth and depth of knowledge with these as something that you can be learning. And it's quite common where these will give you an opportunity to specialize in particular areas. Now, it's quite common also. It's often actually, at least in Australia, these are requirements at a government level for them to include subjects that might be less obviously related to what you're wanting to learn. And this can be a point of friction. So it's quite common in games degrees where there will also be components there of, creative media in general, of understanding sort of, basically building up media literacy and your understanding of where games fit, in the context of things like film and television, music, graphic arts, all these different areas. They are often a point of friction. I think they're actually incredibly valuable. And having come at games from the angle that I did, there wasn't a lot of exposure of that with what I was doing. It was very focused on the programming side, and there I had to kind of find my own opportunities to be sort of understanding that broader context. And I didn't really I wasn't aware of what I was missing on that regard until I hit sort of doing the teaching side of things and seeing the value that it could bring. So that is something to be aware of with those longer degrees. Is there going to be subjects in there that you will have to do that you may think these are absolutely not relevant, but I do actually think they are really important, and in particular when done well, they can provide a lot of value to you. Then at the other end of scale, so we finally have sort of these masters or PhD, a doctor of philosophy. So these typically are going to require an existing qualification for entry into them. In particularly, something like a PhD program is usually going to require either a master's or a bachelor's degree with honors. That's quite common for there to be a sort of bit of an entry barrier there for them. These are a deep dive into a narrow area. Essentially, you're really focusing on a specific area. In the case of a PhD, your purpose sort of with doing the PhD is you become an expert in a very specific area and you develop something new, a unique contribution to the field. That's sort of the heart of a PhD, and masters is sort of a lot of overlap with that. So these are not as commonly seen in games. These are something where these are great if you are wanting to head into academia, or if you are wanting to really sort of hone and develop skills in doing research and in working on longer projects and synthesizing complex information. Like, these give you a lot of exposure to doing that, but they also do take a lot of time and can be really intense. So something to be aware of with that. You have to really, really sort of, have a lot of motivation to be able to persist with them. So, as I said, research is a major component of these, and generally you're doing publishing, and it usually culminates in a thesis and presentation. Is a large component of that. It will vary a little bit from place to place, but the general structure there is usually fairly similar. So this is the kinds of degrees that are out there. If you are looking at entering into games, you're looking generally at either somewhere in that diploma to bachelor's level is typically the sorts of degrees people would study there. So what are some of the things that you can actually gain from a degree? Because yes, you get a bit of paper from it, you've got this qualification, but some of the things that you can gain are less tangible. So, okay, one of the big things is in a degree you're going to have a structured environment. A curriculum will have been put together for each individual module. A overall structure has been assembled for the degree in terms of looking at sequencing what stuff you're learning and when and how you're actually being sort of taught the different areas, how you're being assessed on them. And that structured environment can really, really help for folks being able to learn. Learning independently is very doable, but it is also often more challenging. So a structured environment that a degree can provide is really helpful. It also, because of that structure, and because you're at a place learning with other folks, it's possible to incorporate different learning needs, and that's usually something that places will offer. And it's something where if you think that would be beneficial to you, is absolutely a thing that you should be discussing with places to see what sort of adjustments, what sort of support they actually have there. And in terms of support, there should be a lot more with learning and an actual sort of education provider. So guidance and advice in terms of things like your career, in terms of your studies. So not just answering questions about specific subjects, but also in how to approach studying. Those processes and things like that are really important. It's also pretty common for places to provide, also support there for areas such as mental health, which is really good. Studying itself can be really stressful, so having that support there is really, I think, important. And especially there might be other things going on that are affecting your studies, so having support systems there is really good. You get, ideally, first-hand insights into industry practices. So not just the knowledge, but also what are the processes that are following in industry. And that is incredibly valuable. Knowing not just, okay, how to do X, but how to think about X, how to approach X, how to actually, the processes there of how do we test something to make sure that it's fun, which is really difficult. You can develop industry connections through a degree. It might be through specific events organized with industry or going and visiting places, but industry connections are something that you can gain from a degree. a lot of experience working with others. Uh, Group work is always going to be a thing in degrees, and it is often some of the best and worst experiences for people. And that is an important thing because not every person you work with are you going to get along well with. You know, learning how to actually work with other people and learning how to, in a healthy, in a reasonable, calm, appropriate way, resolve differences and to communicate effectively is really important. You get feedback not just on your work, but on how you work. Like getting feedback on a game you've built, how the code you've written or how you've designed the levels is great, but also being able to get feedback on the processes you were using is actually even more valuable because you might never make a level like that again. You might never write a block of code in that particular type of sort of system ever again. But the processes involved in those, you'll be using them every project you're working on. So getting feedback on how you work and on those processes is so important. And a big part of it also should be learning how to learn independently. So not, okay, go Google this, I'm not going to teach you it, but teaching you how to track down information, teaching you how to evaluate that information, and how to actually find the right things that you are looking for to help you solve the problem. So, not just throwing you in the deep end and going, cool, you're independent learning, but teaching you how to actually do that. Again, that structure that this provides is really valuable. And you get to practice and you can get feedback on your communication. Again, so important. Like if you are working, just in terms of working with others, but also in terms of applying to places in interviews, you can get practice at doing that and you can get feedback on it in a degree. So these are all things that you can gain from a degree. Not every degree is going to provide that, but you can gain these things from a degree. So then the big thing is, what should you be looking for in an education provider? So what should you be looking for with someone that provides these degrees? So a big initial thing is look at what they teach. For any subject, there absolutely will be a module guide, might also be called a unit guide or a subject guide. There will be that for a module. And it should tell you a number of key things. It should tell you the size of it. A lot of places will use credit points. But part of that, it should also tell you the sort of hour commitment. So it'll tell you a number of hours that might be in like a lecture or a tutorial or a workshop. It'll often have expectations of, okay, how many hours are you doing outside of class? It will tell you here are the broad topics that you'll be covering. It might not be in the order that they'll be covered in the subject, but it will at least tell you the topics. And it should give you an overview of what the different assessments are and when they are, and if they're different weightings, then what those weightings are. Now, it won't typically give you, okay, here is the exact requirements of what you need to do for it. What it will usually be in a module guide is it will be a description of here is what this assignment is assessing. So it might be things like for loops, and be an indication of here is how it's assessing it. And it might be, okay, you'll be given some code to work with that you might need to fix, or it might be code that you need to write. And then you might need to describe what you've actually done and how and why. So those are common aspects. And there should be a general summary of what the sort of learning objectives or outcomes are for a particular module. So essentially, at the end of it, what should you be able to do? And they generally should be a phrase sort of in that way of what should you be able to do. So things like that should easily be available. Ideally, just on their website. You can go and click, grab the PDFs, and look at them. If they're not, ask for them. I think it's really valuable to get a sense of what are the kinds of things you would be studying, in particular in those first couple of semesters. But you may also want to take a look and see what stuff would you be learning in later ones as well. So like I said, with the topics, have a look at what sort of depth they are. It won't be unusual for a subject to, cover a topic and then that to be revisited later with a greater depth and complexity, and the same topic might be revisited in several subjects. So that's quite common. Big thing also is have a look at who's doing the teaching. Do their staff have industry experience? What was that experience? Does it line up with the kinds of things that you're wanting to be able to do? When did they have that experience? Now, it's not to say that someone without industry experience cannot teach game development well. That's absolutely not the case. I've seen a lot of really great folks who have never, done active game development teach game development incredibly well and incredibly effectively. But it's good to have a mix of folks in there with industry experience. You want to know that there are at least some folks on staff with that industry experience so that they can be bringing that perspective of what the expectations from industry are. So it's important to have at least some. Other thing is, do their staff have teaching experience and how much? Most of the staff very new, or have they been teaching there for a while? Do any of them have actual formal teaching qualifications? These are sort of important things to know in terms of, it's one thing to know a topic. It's a very different thing to be able to teach someone to understand that topic. Like, it is a very different skill set, and those, again, someone with industry experience can learn how to teach, but it is something that does take time. So it's important to know, do they actually have processes there for teaching those staff? Look at reviews of place, Google reviews, Facebook reviews, things like that. What are current and former staff and students saying? You can look at various places like Glassdoor, things like that, see if there are things that staff have said. It's good to get a sense of what does the culture of the place look like. So other important aspect is how do they create and maintain a safe environment? Like when you're working, in any place that you're working or studying, the environment, you want it to be a safe, healthy, happy one. And that is something where that should be a priority, because you can't learn effectively if you're in an environment where you feel uncomfortable or unsafe. So a place prioritizing creating that is essential. You can have the greatest curriculum in the world, the greatest staff in the world, but if the environment is incredibly toxic, if the environment is unsafe, then people aren't going to be able to be learning. So that environment has to be something that is created and actively maintained. A safe environment is not something where you build it and then, cool, done. Job's done, it's all sorted. Have to actively maintain it. And there needs to be processes in place for that. So continuing, because there are a lot of things you should look for. Look at what their students have achieved. This should be something that's mentioned on their website. Are there ones in industry? So there's a couple of important metrics that places should be tracking and should have. So knowing how many students start a degree and then go on to finish it, and what the typical finishing time is really important, because if a degree is advertised as taking X amount of time, but most people take 50% longer than that, firstly, you want to know that up front so you know what you might be getting in for, but also that tells you that the pacing to hit X years might be way too aggressive and way too stressful. That can then impact if you're trying to work alongside study. So really important to know that. And knowing how many actually fully finish. Do people abandon the course? That's important to know. Don't be surprised if that figure of the proportion that start actually finishing is quite low. That's not necessarily unusual, but you kind of want to know that, especially, if you're comparing different places. That's really good to know. If a place has got a fairly high rate of students finishing and in a reasonable time, that would suggest to me that the coursework, the structure there is quite well balanced, and that there's a good level of support for the students. Knowing how many are in industry is also really important. How many of the ones that finish are in jobs, within 6 months, within a year. If most aren't, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a problem with the degree. It could be a problem with the reputation of the place, but it also could mean that the industry is in a bit of a slump at that particular point. That happens. There are cycles to the industry, and you can end up starting a study at a point where, yep, massive hiring happening, but by the time you're finishing, that massive hiring period could have faded. So worth knowing how many folks are in industry after a time. Also, as part of that, getting into the industry, it's good to know what do they do to either help folks get into the industry, but at the very least to be preparing you for it. Most places, it wouldn't be surprising if they don't provide any direct help to get you a job, but every place should be helping prepare you for getting a job. Understanding how to, structure a CV, cover letters, how to go about approaching places, how to make contacts within the industry. These are all things that absolutely, at a bare minimum, should be being covered. Find out if they host events where industry can come along and see student work. Places should be doing this, of, having showcases where they make a point of getting industry folks along, so that you can kind of do effectively an informal interview. And I've seen folks land jobs from setups like that, and it's really, really good. So those events are something that absolutely a place should be doing. Also, I would find out how large the typical classes are. So a really small class or a really large class both have problems, and both have different types of problems. A really small class for group work potentially means you're always working with the same people. It also, tends to be a little bit. They don't sort of, if someone's having a bad day, kind of sort of impacts on the class a lot more. So they don't always work as fluidly. Plus side, a small class does give you often more room to, be going a bit further beyond the material that would normally be covered. So there are some advantages, but small ones end up being a bit tricky. Really large ones, also really tricky. Those, can be a bit of a mess in terms of trying to keep everything on the rails, stuff like of that. So finding out what the class sizes are is really useful. So there are even more things you should be looking for. So one of the big things is, how are they going to assess your work? How frequent are the assessments? So module guides should absolutely tell you this. And this is why you want to look at that and see, okay, in what weeks am I going to have assessments, and looking at it across all of the modules. Because you might have some weeks that are going to have multiple ones due. You might have, here's some where it's a case of back to back of different weeks. It's good to understand the pacing there, so you know what you're likely going to have schedule wise, and you can plan accordingly. It's useful to know how they're grading things. So things might be traditional, sort of, have worth a certain amount of marks, and you give the correct answers and you get the full marks, different things like of that. That might be more holistically graded, where it's more looking at, okay, you've demonstrated X or Y or Z. So there's different ways of assessing stuff, and the various ways, each of them can be made to work well, but it's good to understand how they're actually assessing your work. Also, worth understanding how they handle things like lateness, or if you're ill, other circumstances impact you being able to work. There will absolutely be policies for this, but really important to understand what those are and what the impacts might be there so that you are aware of them in advance. Find out what support they provide. As I mentioned, a place should be providing a bunch of support. How do they support different learning needs? It's very common for places to offer support for this, but it is usually something where they won't ask you what support necessarily you need or prompt you for it. You might need to ask them. And if there is any factors that might impact your studies, your learning, I absolutely recommend talking to places, because generally, what their approach should be, if it's a good place, is figuring out, okay, how do we make this work effectively for you? And so that's a good discussion to have with places. There might be financial support as well. That's something there to find out in terms of, there might be, scholarships or different ways of, payment plans, stuff like that. Find out how that works, just so you, again, understand what sort of the systems and setups are that they have in place. Find out also what it costs and figure that out. Different countries are very, 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 very different in terms of not just costs, but how that cost is managed. And when you might need, if you're paying that back, what the thresholds are for it. Get an understanding of that beforehand. A place absolutely should be able to tell you exactly, here is what, if you complete the degree in the standard amount of time, here is what it will typically cost. That might be, at a minimum, it will cost X, or it might be it will cost around X, but try and get those specific details from them so that you know what the cost is going to be. Find out how failing impacts your studies, because failing can impact in a number of ways. Obviously, there's typically going to be a financial impact of you'll be having to pay to study again. It can also have a progression impact of, it can limit what subjects you can study next. And it may have just a more general academic impact in terms of, there can be limits on the number of times you can fail. So for example, in Australia, for access to some of the government funding, that actually requires a certain pass rate for you to maintain with subjects. And if you don't, then that actually can result in you being barred from accessing that financial support. So really good to understand how failure of a subject might impact, your studies there. And a place will be able to tell you that. There's still more things you should look for. Find out what tools they teach. And what facilities do they provide? Because places might teach Unity or Unreal, Godot, a bunch of different other engines. It's good to know what tools they teach, why they might teach those particular tools. Find out if they teach a range of ones, if there's options to choose. Find out the facilities in terms of, okay, how up to date are the facilities? Can you access them, outside of class times? How easily can you access them outside of class times? Because not everyone is going to necessarily have the equipment you might need at home, especially if it's, stuff like VR devices, or it might be very particular mobile devices. Not everyone is going to have that at home. So it's good to be able to know if you can access that and what the processes are around accessing it. Is the equipment recent? Doesn't need to be the latest, most bleeding edge, this computer is literally just a day old sort of thing. But, if the system's more than 5 years old and hasn't had any upgrades, in that time period, that's possibly not going to be a great development device. Find out if there are showcases, open days, events that you can actually visit where students are demonstrating their work. So you can actually talk to them, find out what their experience is like, and see the kinds of things they're creating. Because it can give you ideas for the kinds of things you might want to create and see if it's going to line up with where you're wanting to take, your sort of game dev journey. Yeah, there should always be students there that you can talk to at those events. If a place is hiding away all of the students and there's not an opportunity to talk to them, that's a bit of a red flag for me. As I mentioned, availability of the campus facilities really important. So in terms of red flags to look for, if a place won't provide module guides, that is pretty weird to me. I can understand ones maybe not being available on website, or at least not full ones up on a website. That is a lot of material, in particular for a large place to maintain. And these module guides are often getting refreshed, which is a good thing. They're getting, updated to be current with, industry. So that's a good thing. But if you directly ask and they say that they can't or won't, that's weird. There is nothing in a module guide that warrants being kept secret at all. So if they're not providing them, that seems very strange to me. If they won't give you stats on completion rates, employment rates, how long it typically takes to finish a degree, again, these are not likely to necessarily be up on the website. They might be in some cases, but these are things that you can ask. And if they're not able to tell you that or won't tell you that, it could be that they don't know, which is bad, or it could be that they know and they're really not good. Either way, if the information isn't being given, that would be a concern for me. If they won't give you details, now this is something that I think absolutely should be up on a website, no matter what, of how do they make sure the environment is safe? How have they created a safe environment? How do they maintain it? What are their processes around if there are things that have, breached that? That's information that should just be upfront and easily accessible and made very clear. If they don't provide any details on what students have achieved, that is really weird. And again, this is something that I think should absolutely be on a website, of linking to here is cool things that our students have made, because seeing cool stuff that students have done should always be a moment of celebration, and the staff should be celebrating that, and the education provider as a whole should be celebrating that. So if there's not that on the website, that's weird to me. If they won't give you any details on the industry experience of the staff, that's also, again, that would be something that should be up on the website. This is marketing, essentially, because if your staff have got a whole bunch of industry experience, you want people to know, because that is a massive selling point. You want to know what stuff they've done, what areas of specialty, what sort of subjects they teach. These are things that absolutely a place should be telling you. If you look at the assessment schedule and there's a lot of sort of periods where things are either overlapping or just periods where it is just no let up of assessment after assessment after assessment, that's going to be a bit crunch style. That is going to be not good. That potentially means there's not good coordination between the different subjects, which isn't great. That might mean that the entire program is a little bit shaky in that regard. There might be way too much stuff is just online, but at no sort of proper support system. So, the pandemic, did result in a lot of things moving online. And it's not to say that teaching can't be done effectively online. It can, but it takes a lot more effort because when you're teaching online, you don't as easily pick up on sort of nonverbal cues and so forth from people. So it's a lot more intense doing that teaching. It's a lot tougher for the students as well. I would be the first to admit that I don't think I could have done my studies online. At least certainly not when I did them. I just don't think I would have been able to maintain the focus for the length of time needed for that. So online is really much more difficult. So if most of the course is online, that you want to know, how do they actually make this work? What sort of stuff is there for providing that sort of social component that students could easily miss out on? What is there to be checking in on the well-being of people? Also just supporting staff because of that much more intense load. So efforts mostly online, find out what sort of support stuff is provided there. If there isn't much, that's not a good thing. If places continually making huge sweeping changes to the curriculum, or how everything's assessed, in particular if they're doing that, without a lot of lead time for staff or students, that's not good. Kind of seems in those cases where they're potentially making change for change's sake and they're being reactive rather than proactive, and it's more about them ticking a box than actually delivering a good experience for the students and training and teaching the students to the best of their ability. The other thing that's a red flag for me is if most of the staff aren't full-time. And I'll explain why this is a bit of a red flag. If there's only like, one, two staff that are full-time, but then there's half a dozen or more part-time staff, that can mean that they've got a workforce where there's not a lot of cross communication, where there's not a lot of time that those people can invest in supporting students. So you might find that it's a case where, okay, your teacher for one subject, they might only be available one day a week. So this is something where it's good to know that, because it might mean if you run into troubles that there is a long delay before you can actually get help and support with problems that you're running into. So an important thing to actually check. And if the place has a lot of sizzle but not much sausage, but what I mean by this is if the place talks a lot of buzzwords but doesn't back it up. So in particular, if there's lots of buzzwords, but they're not showing you what recent students have achieved, you're not able to talk to students, they're not telling you about industry experience of staff, they're not telling you completion progression rates there. That they're focusing on a lot of the buzzwords, but they're not actually necessarily proving that they're delivering a good product, a good teaching experience there. So always something to be mindful of. The more buzzwords, I would usually sort of make sure you're asking a lot more questions there if that's the case. So alternatives. What could you do instead? There are a huge amount of good, completely free tutorials out there. Some ones that I would recommend, CodeMonkey, Freya Holmer in particular for shader or maths things. Freya's stuff is phenomenal. And on the topic of shaders, Art of Code is just an absolute gem in terms of shaders. I have learnt so much from those tutorials. Sebastian Larg has some great ones. Turbo Makes Games, me obviously, and a lot of other ones. So there's a lot of great free tutorials out there that you can do. Everyone's going to have slightly different styles of how we teach, and that's actually a good thing because the style that I follow, might not work for you. And that's okay, because the style that then one of the others follows might work for you. So it's good that there is a mix of different approaches. I think that's actually really important. There are paid online courses. I would be making sure that you look at reviews, do some Google searching of the people teaching that course, of the course itself, get an understanding of, okay, what has people's experience been like with it? Does it come with support? Get a good sense there before you spend any money, just so you can make sure that you're making an informed choice. You can participate in game jams. Game jams are awesome. itch.io has a giant calendar of so many game jams, and they are a fantastic way to be getting better at making games. I strongly recommend doing things like game jams. They could be solo, they could be with another, a small group. The thing I'd recommend there, if you're working with a group, is try and keep it as small as possible, and keep what you're aiming for. Aim for something very simple initially. Scale up over time. So while working with others is great, just make sure you keep it manageable. You can work on your own projects. Now, working on your own projects can be challenging. Staying focused, things like that is a big challenge there. The big thing I would say with that is keep them very, 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 very small. Like something where it takes you 1 to 2 days, and at the end of that, you're done. That might mean that, and in particular, the way I would recommend approaching this is that you view it as you have this bucket of hours to spend. Once you have spent that bucket, then the game is done. You don't do any further work on it. The reason I recommend that is because then when you get down to the point where you're like, okay, I've only got 4 hours left that I can spend on this, what that causes is you to have to think, okay, how can I make this the best that it can be in those 4 hours? And that is a really good process to go through, a really valuable process to be thinking about. So that's how I would recommend approaching working on your own projects. And with these, try to keep the amount of new things that you're doing pretty limited in each project. And embrace them being messy, embrace them being bad. You have to make a lot of bad games to figure out how to make good games. And even in making a bad game, you can learn a lot, which is great. It's like learning to play a musical instrument, or learning to paint, learning, any of these sort of forms of creative expression. Your early versions are going to be bad. Your early versions are going to be terrible, and you're going to be doing a lot of stuff, very repetitive, but that's okay. That's how we learn. So keep it small is the big thing. That allows you to finish things, and that process of finishing things is really valuable. So, in the end, what should you do? Make sure you weigh up your options carefully. There are a lot of different options there that you can choose, and you want to make sure you make an informed decision about what you actually pick. So figure out when if you're going to open days, things like that, figure out questions to ask places. You can I would do some initial looking on their website, see what you can find there, because you might get answers there, or that might lead to further questions, but figure out those lists of questions. And some of the earlier slides in this might be useful for that. Invest that time to properly and carefully figure out a place and what that place, how well it fits you before you spend money on it. It's really important. Also figure out why you want to study and what your current goals are. Be prepared that during study, those goals might change. And you might hit a point in the study where you're like, actually, I don't want to make games. And that's okay. Talk to people at the place, talk to the staff there, and they'll be able to help you. It's okay if you have that realization. The goal is to try and have that realization as early as possible, but it can take time. But understand what it is that you want to get out of study and talk to the places about that. Because what you might want to be achieving might not be what their courses are set up to help you achieve. And it's important to know that as early as possible. So if you have the time, it's absolutely valuable to be diving into free courses, free tutorials, even if you're planning to do a degree. All it will do is set you up to have a bit of a better understanding so you can go deeper on the subjects and also have a bit of a less stressful time. Because a big part of doing sort of a degree is learning how to approach it. It's very different to often stuff of how you learn in school. It's a lot more independent with a degree. So if you're more familiar with a bunch of topics beforehand, it can allow you to focus more on that, getting comfortable with the processes there in a degree. So if you already know stuff as well, a good place is going to be able to help you build on that even further. They're going to be able to say, okay, cool. Well, where are you liking to, head with this, and give you guidance on, cool. Yep, you already know this area of programming. Here's some resources. Here's some areas to look into on this other area, or similar with design or art. So a good place can help you with that. So at the end of the day, the key thing is taking the time, putting in the effort to make sure that you make a careful and informed decision. And if you have further questions based on any of the stuff I've covered here or other things you'd like to know about degrees, then chuck those in a comment below. If there's other areas you would like me to talk about in terms of things like study or study alternatives, then also mention that as well. So if there's any questions that you've got there or suggestions of things you'd like me to talk about, just mention that in a comment. And for these slides, there is a link in the description where you can find them. And again, there might be a bunch of useful questions there if you're trying to think of ones to ask a place. But until next time, bye.